The morning sky was still a dull shade of gray when I pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching against the gravel. This drive to the hospital had become so routine that I almost fooled myself into believing everything was normal. But nothing about it was normal. My cancer was getting worse, and I knew it deep inside. What made it harder was knowing my wife had no idea. I chose not to tell her. I convinced myself it was the right thing to do, to spare her the pain, to give her the peace of thinking everything was fine. She thought I left early every morning to go to work. Instead, my first stop was always the hospital. Only after the tests, the scans, and the pills would I drag myself to the office, pretending the weight pressing down on me didn't exist. Every day was harder than the last, but I pushed through it anyway. I told myself that love meant sparing the ones closest to you from unnecessary pain. I would endure it silently, so that she wouldn't have to. I still remember the way she kissed me on the cheek that morning before I left. Her lips warm, her breath soft as she told me to have a good day. She didn't know how those little moments were the only thing keeping me going. When I reached the hospital, I went through the usual motions: routine check-in, the familiar smell of antiseptic, the same exhausted nods from the nurses who had seen me far too often. The doctors knew me by name, but that never made it easier. They took my blood, ran the tests, and gave me more painkillers because it hurt to even sit still. Most days, they told me what I wanted to hear, that the cancer was still advancing, but under control. It had become a cruel mantra, the hope they gave me to keep me functioning. I thought today would be no different. But when the doctor walked into the room, I could tell something was wrong before he even opened his mouth. His eyes were heavy, and the corners of his lips drooped like someone carrying the burden of a truth too difficult to speak. I braced myself, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. 45 days, he said. Maybe a bit more, but we shouldn't count on it. The words landed like a fist to my chest. For a second, everything around me vanished. My breath stopped, and my entire life unraveled in a flash. My daughter's laughter, the vacations we never took, the anniversary dinners we hadn't yet celebrated. I wasn't ready. I thought I had more time. I thought I could fight this long enough to keep it from winning. I sat there in silence, staring at the doctor as if he could somehow take it all back. But he didn't. He just lowered his gaze and offered words of sympathy, words that felt hollow, no matter how kindly meant. They told me they would make me comfortable, that they'd be there every step of the way. But I didn't care about any of that. I was thinking about my wife, Laura, and our little girl. The life we built together. The life I was about to leave behind. By the time I walked out of the hospital, the morning sun had risen, but the light only made everything feel heavier. The bright sky felt like a mockery. How could the world keep turning when mine had stopped? I made it to my car somehow, though I barely remember the walk across the parking lot. I sat behind the wheel, gripping it until my knuckles turned white. Tears burned my eyes, but I let them fall. For the first time in a long while, I didn't try to hold them back. I was supposed to head to work, just like every other day. Keep pretending. But suddenly, none of it mattered. What was the point of meetings and deadlines when I had only weeks left to live? I sat there, paralyzed by the weight of it all. The thought of seeing my wife smile again, of holding my daughter one more time, became both a lifeline and a noose. I reached for my phone without thinking, needing something to pull me out of the spiral. I opened the security app on instinct, hoping to see them, their familiar movements around the house, the life I had fought so hard to protect. But what I saw wasn't what I expected. The camera feeds were blacked out, each screen showing only darkness. My heart began to race. Something wasn't right. I switched to another feed, hoping it was just a glitch, but the result was the same. Then I heard it, faint, but clear enough to pierce through the haze in my mind. A sound I knew too well. It was my wife's voice. Her moaning, unmistakable in its intimacy. I sat there, frozen, the phone trembling in my hands. My breath hitched as reality sunk in, piece by agonizing piece. There was no mistaking what I was hearing. She was with someone else? Right there, in our home, while I sat alone in a hospital parking lot, my world already falling apart. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping I was wrong. Maybe I was hearing things. Maybe it was just some horrible coincidence. But the sounds only grew louder, more rhythmic, confirming what my heart refused to believe. She was betraying me, in the house I fought to protect, while I counted down the days I had left to live. I stayed in the car, tears flowing freely, my breath shaky and uneven. The weight of the diagnosis had already shattered me, but what I heard just now, my wife's moaning, felt like someone taking a sledgehammer to the pieces that were left. For 30 minutes, I sat frozen, unable to move, as if the sound had drained all the fight from me. It felt impossible to process both realities at once. 45 days to live, and now this. My wife, the person I had trusted above all else, betraying me in the worst possible way. My fingers fumbled over my phone as I desperately tried to gather myself. I needed to see my daughter, even if it was just through a screen. Maybe she was in her room, blissfully unaware of everything crumbling around her. Maybe seeing her would give me something, anything to hold on to. I opened the camera app connected to the security system at home, expecting to find a glimpse of the life I had been holding on to with every ounce of strength. But the screen showed nothing but black. Each camera feed was covered, every angle blocked, smothered in darkness. Confusion took over for a brief moment, clouding my pain. I muttered to myself, "What the hell is going on?" and tried another camera. The same thing, just black. A cold dread wrapped around my chest, squeezing tighter with each second. Something wasn't right. My hand trembled as I cycled through the feeds, trying each one in growing desperation. They were all the same, all dark. Then I heard it again, that sound. It was low at first, muffled through the audio feed, but unmistakably hers. My wife's moaning filled the silence, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. The intimacy in her voice, the pleasure, the longing, was something I hadn't heard in a long time. It gutted me in a way I didn't know was possible. For a brief second, I held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, it was something innocent. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, warped by exhaustion and fear. But then the sounds became clearer, more distinct, breathless gasps, soft whimpers, and hushed words exchanged in the way lovers do. There was no doubt now. She wasn't alone. Someone else was with her, and the truth was right there, echoing through the feed as if the universe wanted me to hear every second of it. My chest tightened, the air squeezed out of my lungs. I wanted to throw the phone out of the window, to shatter it into pieces. But I couldn't move. I could only sit there, paralyzed by the sheer weight of betrayal, letting it consume me. How? How could she do this? And why now, when I had been fighting with every fiber of my being to stay alive for them? For her? The pain in my chest shifted into something darker. Anger swelled inside me, crashing like a tidal wave. I wasn't thinking anymore. I didn't care about consequences or common sense. I just wanted to escape, get away from the reality I was trapped in. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition, gripping the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles turned white. The tears blurred my vision, but I didn't care. All I could think about was the betrayal replaying in my mind. Her voice, the sounds of someone else touching her. Someone who wasn't me. I floored the accelerator. The car roared to life, and I tore out of the parking lot, tires screeching against the asphalt. The speedometer climbed steadily. 80, 100, 120, until the world outside became a blur of colors and motion. I needed to get away, needed to outrun the agony clawing at my chest. I pushed harder, the needle climbing to 140 as I swerved recklessly through traffic, weaving between cars with no thought for my safety or anyone else's. My mind was a storm of shattered memories, broken promises, and wasted fights to survive a future that no longer existed. Then I hit the curve. The wheels skidded, the tires screaming against the road. I lost control. The steering wheel jerked wildly in my hands as the car spun, flipping once, twice, maybe more. The world became a swirling vortex of glass and metal, a violent dance that I had no control over. The sound of the impact was deafening. Glass shattered. Metal crunched. The horn blared endlessly, a sharp reminder of the chaos I had created. My body slammed against the seatbelt, ribs bruising, head colliding with the side window. Pain exploded in every part of me, and I screamed, though I couldn't even hear myself over the noise. And then everything went black. I don't remember much of what happened next. Only fragments, hazy and disjointed. There were voices, people shouting. Someone was pulling me from the wreckage, hands gripping me tightly, hauling me out of the mangled metal that had once been my car. I remember the distant wail of sirens. Then nothing. When I opened my eyes again, I was staring at the ceiling of a hospital room, fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow overhead. The pain hit me like a freight train, radiating from every part of my body. It was hard to breathe. My right arm was in a cast, my shoulder felt like it had been ripped apart, and my head throbbed from a concussion that made it impossible to think clearly. Then I heard it, a sound that cut through the haze and settled right into the core of my broken heart. It was her, my wife. She was crying softly, holding our daughter close to her chest. The sight of them together, a picture of the life I had fought so hard for, made the pain worse. She looked at me with swollen, red eyes, her expression a mixture of guilt and fear. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't tell if it was the pain or the weight of everything that had happened that made it impossible to speak. My throat felt dry, my mind foggy and slow. A nurse entered the room, her voice gentle but professional. "You're awake," she said, glancing down at her clipboard. "You've got a broken right arm, a concussion, and a dislocated collarbone. You're lucky to be alive." Lucky. The word felt like a cruel joke. I didn't feel lucky. I felt broken physically, emotionally, in every way that mattered. I stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the wreckage that my life had become. She sat by my side, still holding our daughter, her tears falling silently. I could see the apology in her eyes, but she didn't know. She had no idea that her betrayal had driven me to the brink, or that the crash was the result of everything I had discovered. I closed my eyes again, not because I wanted to rest, but because it hurt too much to look at them. Lying in that hospital bed, the pain was relentless, but it wasn't just my body that hurt. It was the weight of everything I carried inside. The secrets, the betrayal, and the knowledge that my life was slipping away faster than I had ever imagined. My wife sat beside me almost every day, holding my hand, brushing the hair from my forehead, whispering how sorry she was that I had gone through such a terrible accident. But she didn't know. She didn't know that the crash wasn't just bad luck. It was because of her. She didn't know that the cancer was eating me alive, that every morning for months I had smiled through the pain just to protect her. She didn't know that the betrayal I uncovered in the car that morning had pushed me to the edge, that her affair had shattered my will to keep going. I lay there, a prisoner in my own body, with nothing but my broken thoughts for company. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was knowing that the person I had fought for, the person I had built a life with, had chosen someone else while I fought alone. She sat beside me, crying softly, her fingers curling over mine. But I felt nothing. I stared at the ceiling as each day blurred into the next, the constant ache in my chest growing worse. Not just from the cancer, but from knowing she still had no idea what she had done to me. I stopped eating. Food tasted like ash in my mouth. I stopped drinking too, though the nurses did what they could to force fluids into me. It didn't matter. The days felt endless, each one dragging me closer to the inevitable. My mind swirled with anger, sadness, and exhaustion, all tangled together in a knot I couldn't unravel. Then one morning, the silence between us grew too thick to bear. She sat in the chair beside me, fiddling nervously with the corner of her sleeve, watching me through swollen eyes. Her guilt was written all over her face, but it wasn't enough. I knew I had to say the words, had to tell her the truth, even if it broke both of us. With every ounce of strength I had left, I tried to sit up, but my body refused to cooperate. The pain surged, and I collapsed back onto the pillows, gasping for air. She rushed to steady me, placing a hand on my chest, but I pushed her away weakly. I needed to say it. If I didn't, it would fester inside me until it consumed what little time I had left. "I have cancer," I rasped, my voice barely more than a whisper. It took all my strength to force the words out. I have about 40 days left, maybe less. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, it looked like she didn't understand what I was saying, like the words didn't belong in the world she lived in. But slowly, the realization dawned on her, and her hand shot to her mouth in disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of emotion. But I wasn't finished. I had more to say, and the weight of it pressed down on me like a stone. "I know." My voice wavered, but I pushed through the exhaustion. "I know about you. About him. I know you cheated on me." Her eyes widened in horror, and I saw her soul crumble under the weight of those words. She stumbled back a step, as if the confession had struck her physically. I wanted to scream at her, to unleash all the anger that had been eating away at me since that morning. But I couldn't. My body was too weak to shout, too broken to rage. So instead, I just lay there, tears welling in my eyes, my heart breaking all over again as I whispered the question that had haunted me every moment since I found out. "Why?" She collapsed into the chair, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs as she struggled to find the words. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw with regret. We hadn't been together in over a month," she admitted between gasps. I tried to talk to you about it. But every time, you told me you weren't in the mood." The words sliced through me like a blade. The truth of them was undeniable, and that made it worse. She wasn't lying. I remembered those nights, the way I turned away from her, too tired and too sick to give her the affection she craved. She had needed something from me that I couldn't give, and instead of fighting for us, she found it in someone else's arms. Tears spilled down my face, hot and bitter. I wasn't angry at her excuses. I was angry at everything. Angry at the cancer, angry at life, angry at myself for not being enough. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Don't," I muttered, my voice thick with emotion. "Just go." She sobbed harder, but I couldn't bear to look at her. I turned my head toward the window, blinking against the tears that blurred my vision. All I wanted was to be alone, alone with the weight of what I had lost and the unbearable knowledge that my time was running out. She tried to come back every day after that. She sat by my bedside, tears in her eyes, begging for forgiveness. But I couldn't look at her. Every time I saw her face, all I could hear was her moaning, the sound of another man taking what was supposed to be mine. I wanted to forgive her. I wanted to find some peace in the little time I had left. But every time I tried, the betrayal swallowed me whole. She cried for me, but I didn't care. She told me she was sorry, but the words rang hollow. She wanted me to understand, but how could I? How could she? Discharge me from the hospital. I felt like a ghost in my own skin. My body was fragile, held together by pins, casts, and sheer willpower. Each step sent pain shooting through me, but I forced myself to move. I had waited long enough, letting the betrayal fester inside me like an untreated wound. The time for silence was over. She was waiting outside, sitting in the driver's seat, wringing her hands on the steering wheel as if nervous to see me. I hated that she looked so broken, hated that I still cared, even after everything. But the moment I got into the car, the storm inside me broke loose. I didn't even try to hold it back. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I roared, the words coming out in jagged bursts. The seatbelt dug into my chest as I leaned forward, shouting at her with every bit of rage I had bottled up inside. "It's your fault. Your fault I crashed. Your fault I almost died." She flinched as if I had struck her, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't know," she cried, clutching the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. "I didn't know what you were going through." But her tears didn't move me. I was too far gone, too hurt, too betrayed. My voice cracked as I kept shouting, unable to stop. "You betrayed me when I was dying. While I was trying to save what little time I had left with you and our daughter. You threw it all away." She sobbed so hard she could barely see the road, but I didn't care. I needed answers, and I needed them now. "Who was it?" I demanded, the words seething through clenched teeth. "Tell me who it was." At first, she shook her head, trying to avoid the truth. But I wasn't letting this go. Not now. Not ever. Who? I shouted again, slamming my good hand against the dashboard, making her flinch. I deserve to know. And then, through ragged breaths, she said it. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. It was him, my childhood friend, someone I had trusted all my life, someone I had grown up with, shared my best and worst moments with, a brother in every way but blood. I couldn't breathe. The betrayal deepened, cutting me in ways I didn't think were possible. It wasn't just her. It was him too. They had both stolen what little I had left. The moment she pulled into the driveway, I jumped out of the car without a word. I couldn't stay in that house. Not with her, not after what I had just learned. My cast thumped against my side as I got into my own car, ignoring her pleas for me to stop. I had one destination in mind: his house. The drive felt like a blur. Every mile was filled with rage, every turn tighter than the last. My blood boiled with thoughts of everything I had lost, everything he had taken from me. By the time I pulled into his neighborhood, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over his perfect life. There he was, outside with his family. His kids ran across the yard, laughing as his wife called them to the dinner table. They were smiling, enjoying the kind of life I had fought so hard to protect, while my own crumbled to dust. The moment he saw me, his face turned pale. He knew. He knew why I was there, and the fear in his eyes only confirmed it. I didn't think. I just acted. Even with the cast on my arm, I lunged at him, rage making me forget the pain. He tried to back away, but I was faster. I slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. "How could you?" I screamed, my voice raw and broken. "You were supposed to be my brother." His wife stood frozen in shock, trying to make sense of what was happening. She clutched her children close as they stared wide-eyed at the scene unfolding in front of them. "I trusted you," I shouted, my fists clenched at my sides. I wanted to hit him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused me. But before I could, his wife stepped forward, confusion written all over her face. "What is he talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. I locked eyes with her, the words heavy and damning. "He slept with my wife," I said, spitting the truth into the open air. "While I was dying, your husband was in my bed." Her face crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes as she stumbled backward, clutching her children even tighter. "No," she whispered, disbelief shaking her voice. "That can't be true." But it was. I saw the truth reflected in his cowardly silence, the way his gaze dropped to the ground, unable to meet hers. The rage inside me surged again, and before I knew what I was doing, my left hand swung. My fist connected with his jaw, and he staggered back, crumpling to the ground. Pain shot through my arm, but I didn't care. Not in that moment. He scrambled to his feet, rage flaring in his eyes now. He rushed at me, and we crashed into each other again, fists flying. Pain tore through my body with every movement, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The fight spilled into his backyard, his kids screaming for their mother. Neighbors poked their heads over fences, drawn by the chaos. I barely noticed them. All I could see was him, his betrayal, his smug face. Every punch I threw was meant to erase the memory of what he had taken from me. We were rolling on the ground, grappling like animals, when the police arrived. They pulled us apart, their hands firm and unyielding, and hauled us to our feet. I could hear his wife sobbing in the background, packing her things in a frenzy as her perfect little world fell apart. He glared at me, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. "What the hell have you done?" he shouted, rage and fear twisting his voice. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The officers shoved us into the back of a squad car, locking the doors behind us. We sat in silence, the weight of everything that had just happened settling over us like a suffocating fog. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt something other than anger. It wasn't peace, it was emptiness. The kind that comes when you realize there's nothing left to. The ride to the station was a blur, the air thick with tension. My hands were still shaking from the fight, the adrenaline seeping away, leaving me hollow. I sat next to him, my oldest friend, the man who had ruined everything I held dear, and neither of us spoke a word. The weight of everything hung between us, but there was nothing left to say. We had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. As the car sped through the streets, I thought this was it. I was sure I was going to prison. Part of me welcomed the thought. At least there, I wouldn't have to face the wreckage of my life. It would be easier to rot in a cell than spend what little time I had left staring into the faces of people who had betrayed me. But when we arrived at the station, something unexpected happened. The officers let us go. They gave us stern warnings, a lecture about disturbing the peace and trespassing, but no charges. Just like that, they unlocked the doors and told us we were free to leave. I stood there, stunned, feeling as if I had been spat back into a nightmare I couldn't escape. When my wife arrived to pick me up, I didn't even look at her. I climbed into the car, my body heavy with exhaustion, and stared out the window, tears burning my eyes. I could feel her gaze on me, filled with sorrow and regret, but I had no strength left to care. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the tears had started falling, silent hot streams down my cheeks. I didn't try to stop them. It hit me then, truly hit me, that I was going to live out the last days of my life like this. Not in peace, not with dignity, but buried under betrayal, anger, and regret. When we got inside the house, I couldn't take it anymore. I looked at her, this woman I had loved, this woman who had destroyed everything, and I told her to leave. I kicked her out along with her child. The words felt like knives on my tongue, but I said them anyway. Get out, both of you. She begged me to reconsider, tears streaming down her face, but I was done. I couldn't look at her, couldn't even stand to be in the same room with her. But I also couldn't bring myself to leave our daughter behind, knowing that my time was running out. It was a cruel paradox, pushing away the people I loved, knowing they were all I had left. I sat alone in that house, consumed by the silence, haunted by every memory that replayed in my mind. The quiet was suffocating, but it was better than seeing her face every day, knowing what she had done. The next morning, I woke to the sound of shattering glass and a door slamming open. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard footsteps, heavy and fast, and I knew exactly who it was. He was here. Before I could even sit up, he was on me, fists flying with unrelenting fury. It was him, my so-called friend, the man who had ruined my life and now wanted to finish the job. His knuckles collided with my jaw, sending a sharp jolt of pain through my already broken body. I tried to fight back, but I was too weak, too slow. The cast on my arm made it impossible to defend myself. He pinned me down, each blow landing harder than the last. My ribs ached, my vision blurred, and the room spun around me. I could barely hear his furious words, only fragments cutting through the haze. You ruined my family. What the hell were you thinking? I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my body wouldn't listen. I could feel the life draining out of me with every punch, every second that passed. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I tried to stay conscious, but it was no use. Darkness closed in, and everything faded to black. When I woke up, I was back in the hospital. The same sterile smell, the same harsh fluorescent lights. Every bone in my body felt like it had been crushed beneath a weight I couldn't lift. And there she was, my wife, sitting beside me once again, tears streaking her face. She whispered my name over and over, her hand trembling as she brushed my hair from my forehead. But I could only stare at the ceiling, numb and broken. A police officer entered the room not long after, notebook in hand. He asked what had happened, his voice calm and professional, as if this were just another routine call. The nurses had reported my injuries, and now they needed my statement. I told them everything. The betrayal, the fight, how he had broken into my home and attacked me, leaving me for dead. The officer nodded, scribbling in his notebook. "We'll take care of it," he said. And they did. The very next day, they arrested him. He was facing up to 5 years in prison for the assault. It should have felt like justice. It should have brought me some kind of peace. But it didn't. When my wife tried to speak to me again, I finally found the strength to do what I should have done the moment I heard her with him. "Get out," I whispered, my voice hoarse and cracked. "For good this time." She cried, begged, pleaded for forgiveness. But I was done. I couldn't bear the sight of her. Not anymore. I had tried to fight for us, fought even when the cancer told me to stop. But she had already made her choice, and I had to make mine. She left that night, the sound of her sobs trailing behind her as she packed her things and closed the door. And this time, I didn't stop her. For the first time in months, I was alone, truly, utterly alone, and it felt like the only thing I had left. The hospital bed became my final place, a cage I couldn't escape. I was too weak to leave, too broken to fight. My body was giving up faster than I had anticipated, each day dragging me closer to the inevitable. The doctors stopped mentioning discharge. They knew it wasn't going to happen. I couldn't eat. Every bite felt like a burden I couldn't bear. Sleep became a distant memory, stolen by the relentless pain that no amount of medication could dull. The cancer was in control now, spreading rapidly, ravaging whatever was left of me. The doctors gave me their final estimate, 15 days, maybe less. I cried when they told me, but not because I feared death. I cried because my life was already over, and not in the way I had imagined. The betrayal haunted me, night after night, like a recurring nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My wife's face flashed in my mind, along with the sound of her voice, the moans that shattered everything I had fought to preserve. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make peace with it. I couldn't forgive her, and I couldn't forgive myself for holding on to hope for so long. Every day in that sterile room felt endless, the walls closing in tighter around me. Nurses came and went, their faces blurring together in the haze of my pain. They gave me powerful painkillers, but even those failed to reach the places that hurt the most. It wasn't just my body that was broken. My heart, my spirit, my will to keep going had all crumbled into dust. When the nurses left me alone, I took the only comfort I could find. I reached for the notebook on the small table by my bed, hands trembling, and began to write. It was a letter addressed to my wife. I poured everything into it, the love I had once felt, the pain of her betrayal, the agony of knowing I wouldn't be there for our daughter as she grew up. I told her that I forgave her, even though I didn't know if it was true. Maybe I hoped that by writing it, some part of me would believe it. I told her that I was sorry too. Sorry that I had shut her out, that I hadn't been able to give her what she needed when she needed it most. It was a farewell letter more than anything else. Not just to her, but to the life we had built together, the life I was leaving behind. When I finished writing, I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the nightstand, hoping that one day it might bring her some kind of peace. As the days went by, friends began to visit. Some came with flowers, others with awkward smiles, unsure of what to say to a man on the brink of death. They sat by my bedside, shared stories, tried to make me laugh, but I could see the sadness in their eyes. They knew, just as I did, that this was goodbye. And with every goodbye, the weight of it all grew heavier. I tried to hold back the tears, but I failed every time. It was too much loss, too much regret, too many things left unsaid. The nights were the hardest. The pain gnawed at me relentlessly, and the silence was deafening. No matter how much they tried to ease my suffering, the medication never touched the ache in my chest. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that never came. I waited for the pain to stop, but it never did. Eventually, I stopped fighting. I knew my time was running out, and there was no point in struggling against what was inevitable. I lay there, day after day, feeling myself fade away bit by bit, resigned to my fate. This was how it would end, not with closure, not with peace, but with silence. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but it didn't matter. My body had already made the choice for me. And so, I waited,